Hey, welcome back to another edition of the Friday Show. I'm Ray Paulick, joined this week by our editor-in-chief, Natalie Voss. Natalie had the pleasure of sitting through 2 days of an appellate hearing for Bob Baffert's positive test for lidocaine that were a year old. This was on 2020 Arkansas Derby Day when Gamine won an allowance race and was subsequently disqualified. And Charlatan won a division of the Arkansas Derby, grade 1 race that meant a lot to his price as a stallion prospect. And he was disqualified for lidocaine as well. Bob Baffert was suspended 15 days for both of the positive tests. The horses were disqualified from their wins. Those disqualifications and the suspension were appealed. And lo and behold, the Arkansas Racing Commission decided to do what, Natalie?
So they decided to modify the stewards' original decision, removing the suspension for Baffert, restoring the horses to their original finished positions, and sending back the purse money back to those horses. And they decided, instead of suspending Baffert, to issue 2 fines. I believe it was $5,000 for each violation.
Oh, that's going to leave a mark, isn't it? Jeez.
I mean, especially when that prize money comes back, you know.
Well, and I mean, it was $5,000 fine for each horse. But you think of one of the witnesses I happened to notice said, yeah, I got paid $5,000 to come here and testify as an expert. Who knows how much they spent on this defense. But the stakes were really high when you do consider Charlatan's stallion value and the importance of a grade 1 victory.
Yeah, I mean, as we know, there can often be bonuses structured in the contract when horses' breeding rights are sold, but they are still running. But we don't know the terms of the contract in Charlatan's case. And Baffert was asked about that. He actually testified on the second day of the hearings. Originally, they had said they didn't think he was going to, but then on the second day he did. And one of the things that the commissioners asked him was sort of like, well, what did this decision cost you? And referring to the terms of the stud deal. And he didn't really get into the specifics on that, other than to say, like, yeah, well, there sometimes are bonuses for, you know, different placings and grade 1 placings and that sort of thing. So we don't know, but we can assume that there probably is likely to have been something like that in play, where this is a valuable decision for them.
I would venture to say it was worth more than the purse money, and it was $1 million race. So I'm assuming here then, and I didn't sit through the whole 12 hours or whatever it was.
15 hours. 15 hours. Yeah, so give me credit.
So I'm assuming that there was irrefutable evidence that said our laboratory and the split sample laboratory at UC Davis, the main laboratory, was supposed to be Truesdale in California, but Truesdale lost their accreditation, so they subcontracted to industrial laboratories in Colorado. So I'm assuming that there was irrefutable evidence that the laboratories made a mistake and there was no lidocaine found in the horse's sample. Is that correct?
No, I would not say that they presented irrefutable evidence, and I don't think that they particularly tried to say that they had irrefutable evidence that there was no lidocaine. Baffert's attorney presented, I think, a 7-point list of reasons that they should throw out the positives.
Lists are good. Lists are very good. I love 7-point lists. Those are good.
There was a PowerPoint presentation, actually, and I saw it sort of coming. I'm watching this through live stream, and I sort of saw it coming up, and it's like, oh no, the attorney has a PowerPoint. But it was 7 different points, and I would say that, you know, some of them were kind of major, some of them were a little more minor in terms of how much time they spent on them and how kind of meaty they seemed to be. But a lot of the argument, although not all of it, seemed to be based on there were some mistakes that were made by the laboratory at Truesdale. Probably the most important one being that the chain of custody was not absolutely clear. They have to have documentation when samples are taken from horses, sent to the laboratory, tested at the laboratory. They have to be able to show exactly where those samples went and why and when, and to be able to assure that there was no possibility of tampering with them. And Baffert's attorneys made a lot of the fact that the samples went from the racetrack to Truesdale. Truesdale logged them into the computer, but they could not actually test them because of the accreditation issue. So they repackaged them into a different cooler and sent them to Industrial. And Baffert's attorneys pointed out that we didn't have what they considered at least the usual documentation for how those samples were repackaged and exactly why. However, Industrial and also UC Davis, which was the lab that tested the split samples, did say that the security tape and everything on the tubes and vials of the horse's blood and urine was still intact when they got them, suggesting that they had not been opened prior to them being tested. There was also a mistake at Truesdale where for Charlatan's sample, the test barn correctly wrote on there that he was a colt on the sample tubes. Then Truesdale logged it into the computer as if he was a gelding and then sent it to Industrial. So then that sort of raised some suspicions about, like, did we test the right sample? If we did test the right sample, as if we thought it was coming from a gelding, then why wasn't there high testosterone? Or did Industrial test it correctly as though it was a colt, but, you know, there was still this paperwork sort of error. So, you know, basically the argument coming from the attorneys was like there were some mistakes here. There were some errors here made primarily by Truesdale that raised some questions about the integrity of those samples, both the original and the split, because of course, urine and blood samples are split in the test barn, typically, I think, at the time that they're taken, and then they're all shipped together. So they were all sort of subject to the same process that the attorneys said were questionable.
But didn't this all happen though? Because Jimmy Barnes, Bob Baffert's assistant, who was actually at Arkansas, Bob stayed home on his couch, I think, for these races, because he wore a salon pass that had lidocaine, because Jimmy, as we know, broke his pelvis a few years ago in a terrible accident at Baxter, and so he was wearing something that had lidocaine on it, and apparently, you know, putting the patch on that day and all that caused him to, make the horse test positive for lidocaine. Isn't that what happened?
So that was, originally the explanation that Baffert had said publicly. When he took the stand Tuesday, I had not at least heard this from him before. If he has said it publicly, I missed it. That he had, for a long time, yes, thought that this was due to the lidocaine patch usage from Jimmy Barnes. But then when he got through this legal process and started finding out more about the testing situation and sort of nailed down some details with Jimmy, he said, well, actually, Jimmy used the patches Thursday and Friday, but not on Saturday on race day. And he also thought it was pretty, he seemed to think it was notable that there was a second place finisher, the second place finisher behind Charlatan, also had lidocaine in his system, although it was not over the regulatory threshold, which made him start wondering, why are there horses with lidocaine floating around?
Was that evidence actually presented, or was that just Bob Baffert saying he'd heard that?
He said that he had heard that. I believe one other witness also said that there was a trace level in another horse that was a second place finisher in one of the two races. Yeah. So we can infer it was that one, I think.
Wouldn't that have been easy enough for the Racing Commission to produce evidence that either confirmed or denied that happened?
The Racing Commission's sort of attitude was like, look, all of this stuff aside, the horses, Baffert's horses, had levels of lidocaine above what we say you're supposed to have. You can sort of throw doubt on the chain of custody. You can throw questions on whether or not lidocaine could be used intentionally to manipulate a race. But regardless, this is the rule. The rule was violated according to the lab test results, and the split sample results confirmed that. So you should uphold what the stewards originally decided. That was basically the commission's arguments.
There have been multiple cases in different states where trainers were able to prove contamination, say a human drug actually got into a horse's system because the groom was abusing drugs, that sort of a thing. And I think in almost every case, the trainer is either held blameless or a minimum fine, but the horse is always disqualified, because the bottom line is the horse has the drug in its system when it ran. And in this case, they didn't do that.
Yeah, and that's, how I've typically heard it explained to me too, is that you would look at the way that you would handle the race outcome separately from the way that you would handle any kind of penalty to the trainer if you thought that there were mitigating circumstances.
Right.
I think that they didn't exactly explain the decision that they made, but I think they must have been leaning pretty heavily on that mitigating circumstances argument, because Arkansas takes its drug classifications and penalty classifications from the RCI model rules. The RCI schematic says, for one thing, they treat like a medication violation as sort of two different sets of punishment, one for the owner being the disqualification and loss of purse versus the trainer, which would be the suspension and or fine. And for a first offense B penalty classification, which is what this was considered, they do have language in there saying, here are the suggested guidelines absent mitigating circumstances, which would mean that then the officials have the opportunity to say, there's mitigating circumstances here, and we don't think that we should go with these minimum guidelines. And that is present for both the trainer and for the owner penalty guidelines. So therefore, it's also a clause that's in there for the disqualification option. Initially, I did not realize that, because it has always been explained to me that like the horse is coming down no matter what. It's just a question of whether you're going to actually blame the trainer. So when they first announced that, I thought, like, is this even possible to decide? But it is in the RCI rules that it's possible for them to take mitigating circumstances into account.
Well, I'm hoping that the Horse Racing Integrity and Safety Authority will kind of handle cases like this better than the Arkansas Racing Commission and the stewards have done. In Arkansas, another thing that you and I talked about offline here, they made a big announcement before this meeting that they were going to be testing for clenbuterol with hair testing. They were going to have a 60-day cutoff. And we've come to find out that they actually are testing for hair, but they can't, if they find it, they can't do anything about it because they don't have a timeline with hair testing when clenbuterol may have been administered. So they made this big announcement, they're doing hair testing, and they are doing hair testing, but they're not doing anything with it. They're finding clenbuterol in horses, but they can't do anything about it. And it's just sort of one big, I think, farce, because of horses can race on clenbuterol at 14 days in some states, 10 days in some states. Arkansas at 60 days. Arkansas says we're going to have this hair testing, but they can't enforce it. It's just, it really makes the industry look bad when these kinds of things happen. The Baffert, the reversal on the disqualifications, and I think the announcement they're going to be doing hair testing, and then they do it and they can't enforce it.
Yeah, it was sort of interesting. We didn't get an actual explanation of why the commissioners voted the way that they did. Yeah. It was a unanimous vote, but you could sort of begin to infer, or try to infer some of the thought process based on the questions the commissioners were asking of witnesses on the second day. The way that it worked was the attorney would call a witness, whichever attorney would call a witness, they would be cross-examined by the other attorney. They'd be redirected by the first attorney, and then the commissioners could ask questions. And what the commissioners seemed to be focusing on more so the second day, and I think that the chair of the commission, Alex Leblanc, might have even said this a couple of times, is like, well, we're in this position where no matter what we decide here, people are going to be upset. Everyone's going to be upset. And we have these rules and we're supposed to enforce these rules. But now you're telling me that these rules are maybe not very good, because there was also debate about, is the threshold appropriate? Is it appropriate to have a threshold for lidocaine at all? That kind of got drug into the case quite a bit as well. And sort of greater medication regulation philosophies. And it was kind of like, well, people are so sensitive to these things. Kind of the vibe I was getting from them, at least, was people are so sensitive to these things. They get upset no matter what you do. You just kind of can't do anything right. And you just can't be unfair and unreasonable. And that seemed to kind of be the thought process that led into like, look, we're just going to kind of let this one go by. And I'm kind of thinking, well, I mean, yeah, people are not going to like this decision. So you might be right that someone would be upset no matter what, but I think you had a lot more people upset about this than you would have if you supported your stewards. Right.
So 15 hours of testimony. How many hours did it take for them to deliberate over this?
I think that there was about, I would need to look back at the timestamps, but I would say about 3 minutes. Oh. It took them to propose a motion. Really, they spent most of that time phrasing what the motion was going to be. They were all going to vote on. One commissioner, whose name I did not catch, did sort of start to speak on his philosophy. The audio cut out for about 10 seconds, and then that was it. That's all there was. And they voted, and that was kind of it. So that's why I'm left to guess what they were thinking.
So basically, they reversed the disqualification and the suspension. because they think maybe there was contamination possibly, but they don't really know for sure. There was no evidence was really presented that there was contamination, but they just questioned the labs following the proper protocols on the samples.
Well, there was that, and there was also kind of like, they did have a number of witnesses say like people are not really using lidocaine to cheat. Of course, part of the reason that it was provided for why trainers are not really using lidocaine to cheat was that it is tested for. But that seemed to be, kind of a factor for them too. Like, this is not dermorphin. This is not some heavy hitting sort of drug. This is something that could have been an environmental exposure or an incidental exposure that probably was not somebody injecting this into a horse's nerve like 30 minutes before the race. And that seemed to factor in for them too, of just like, how big a deal do we want to make out of this really when we are thinking of it as being a relatively low stakes kind of incident. And I mean, I guess in some ways that's true, but it is a high profile case, and people are going to and have perceived this as like, it just doesn't stick, even if it's a low level thing. And that isn't sitting well with a lot of people.
Well, the elephant in the room is that this is Bob Baffert, a horse that won the Triple Crown Justify, had a positive test for scopolamine. The California Horse Racing Board buried it. And whether or not they were going to pursue it, they did not handle it well. Some people are putting an asterisk now on Justify's Triple Crown because of that. That was from the Santa Anita Derby. And now people are going to put an asterisk on Charlatan's Arkansas Derby win. And, it's maybe it's unfortunate for the horse, but it's just it's a symptom of how bad our regulatory structure is.
Yeah, it was sort of interesting. The Baffert's attorney actually quoted Spider-Man in the beginning of his opening, "With great power comes great responsibility." And he was using that to say, the Arkansas Racing Commission, with great power comes your great responsibility to be fair and enforce your rules to the letter regarding testing and all that kind of thing. But you could sort of say it the other way too, like it shouldn't be true that Baffert's cases get treated differently from someone else's. But that is the case because of how powerful he is in the industry, right, and how successful he is. And unfortunately, whether it should be that way or not, that is something that comes along with that reputation. And that's sort of inescapable. So, with great power,
Well, Natalie, thanks for sticking through 15 hours of testimony that I'm sure was riveting every minute. And thanks for all you do for the Paulick Report every day, every week. And really appreciate you joining us on the Friday show this week.
Thank you.
Latrusco continues to lead. Monomoy Girl is now clearly in second. Swiss Skydivers back at the rail in third and two from the front. The rest are far back. Latrusco a quarter mile from home in the Apple Blossom. Just a neck in front of Monomoy Girl, who comes to challenge, and Monomoy Girl has put her head in front. Latrusco's back to second. Swiss Skydiver is two back in third, and Monomoy Girl has a final furlong to get, but Latrusco is battling on bravely. Monomoy Girl a length. Latrusco doing her level best. Monomoy Girl, Latrusco battling back. Latrusco, Monomoy Girl, Latrusco has turned away the champion. Oh my goodness! Latrusco wins the Apple Blossom.
Wow. That was some stretch run. It was a race that was billed as a battle of two champions, Swiss Skydiver and Monomoy Girl. But it was a third champion from Mexico who actually made history here, Joe.
Yeah, and that's the thing. You look at a race like this and you think, why is a horse that went off at, odds of, I think she went off at 3-1 against two bona fide killers in Swiss Skydiver and Monomoy Girl. That's pretty good odds with two heavy favorites like that. Why is this being considered such a big upset? You got to look at her background here. This is a horse that is absolutely breaking ground for the Mexican racing program. Latrusco was a champion in Mexico. She was born in the U.S., or was sired in the U.S. at least. She's a daughter of Super Saver. Went and raced in Mexico. Did a fantastic job. Won multiple grade ones there. Came up to the U.S. and won probably one of the deepest grade ones we've had so far in 2021. And horses that race in Mexico don't do that.
Yeah.
This is really something fantastic. If you look in sort of a plug here, if you look at this week's edition of Bloodlines, Frank Mitchell wrote in depth about Latrusco, her background in the Mexican racing program, and just really how unusual this whole situation is.
Yeah, this comes from the leading stable in Mexico, St. George, and trainer Fausto Gutierrez. Give him a good horse and he can get something done. And all credit to him, to the team that had the faith to bring this horse to the United States. They started out in the Clásico del Caribe. They stayed here. They won some grade 3 races. This was a big step up, but boy, did she run a big race.
And credit to the track announcer too. I don't know if I would have been brave enough to call that head bob when they were there, but did it, got it, nailed it. Well done.
All right. Well, thanks for that, Joe. Now it's time for a toast to Vino Rosso, where we're going to look at one of the Breeders' Cup champions' first foals of 2021.
Yes, sir. So this time around, we're taking a look at a filly from the first crop of Vino Rosso out of the hard-spun mare Twisted Adage. This filly was born on February 25th at St. Simon Place in Lexington, Kentucky, bred by Robert Slack. Tommy Wente boards this filly and her dam at St. Simon Place for the breeder, and Tommy and I agreed that a lot of the people are saying a lot of the same things about the Vino Rossos. Lots of substance, lots of leg, and lots of class. That means Vino Rosso is doing a good job stamping his foals in the early stages, and that's exactly what you want to see at this point of the game. For this one in particular, Tommy said the breeder really believes in a cross between Hardspun and Curlin, so mating his Hardspun mare with one of Curlin's most successful sons on the racetrack made a lot of sense. Sometimes it's best to stick with what you know, especially when you get results like this. And that's our toast to Vino Rosso.
Thank you to Spencer Farm for the sponsorship. And thanks to Natalie Voss for joining us earlier in the Friday show to go through the Bob Baffert appeal in Arkansas. We'll see you next week. Thanks so much for joining us.